pick up more reinforcements. Taiwan holds the beaches, but under intense air attack, they'll be unable to fend off the Chinese troops for long. Hour 6. Somewhere deep behind Russian lines, a series of explosions lights up the early morning sky. Critical air defense radar immediately goes offline. More explosions 30 miles away illuminate a Russian command post. Flying at tens of thousands of feet over war-torn Eastern Europe, 2 American B-2s secretly forward deployed to Europe make their way back to friendly lines. They form a zigzag course to their targets, always presenting their stealthiest side to enemy radar. Russian radar technicians picked up an intermittent contact of something, but were unable to provide a firing solution to air defenses. On the way back to friendly lines, though, the B-2s are slightly more visible to ground and airborne radar, and several interceptors are vectored in on their approximate location. As they near the B-2s, their radars struggle to get a weapons quality lock, as the B-2s take evasive action and defeat enemy radar by angling away from it. Still, it's only a matter of time before Russian MiGs have sniffed out the general location of the bombers and closed in enough that no amount of stealth technology can prevent a good lock. Suddenly, the lead MiG picks up a missile lock warning. Instinctively, he dives his plane, picking up speed and hoping to confuse the incoming missile with ground clutter. There's more warnings across the fleet of incoming interceptors as the MiGs attempt to scramble. The dividing MiGs desperately try to outmaneuver or outrun the incoming missiles, but the short detection range spells doom for many of the pilots. One by one, MiGs are blown out of the sky, with a few surviving and backing off the vulnerable B-2s. Somewhere in the dawn sky, a formation of American F-35s wheels to cover the B-2's retreat. They're some of the few operational F-35s NATO has in service, and though deadly to Russian air defenses, are too few in number to significantly alter the air war. The B-2s must also be used judiciously, as they too are few in number to significantly damage Russia's ability to fight. Hour 24. It's been 1 day since the start of the Third World War. The Sino-Russian alliance has pushed NATO back significantly in the Baltic states as America rushes to recall troops on leave and prepare to embark reinforcements to Europe. It'll take weeks for the U.S. to be ready for ground operations, even with the world's largest logistical fleet preparing around-the-clock flights to Europe. NATO is rushing to marshal a response force in Poland as the Polish military reinforces its defenses on its border with Russia, held Ukraine, and Kaliningrad. After a day of fierce fighting, it's not expected that NATO will hold on to its Baltic allies for long, though that was always expected. NATO navies have initiated a string of anti-submarine defenses that stretch from Greenland to Iceland and to the UK to help safeguard U.S. troop ships as the first rushed reinforcements begin to load on the ships on the U.S. East and Gulf coasts. In the Baltic Sea, fierce fighting between NATO ships and the Russian Navy has kept Russian naval firepower at bay, as it has so often found itself throughout history.
Hey, you know, how do I put this? Being a middle-aged dude dancing with his top off in a dance club, yeah, it only really works if it's a cool dance club. And this one isn't, or it isn't anymore. Can you run some promotions on the computer to get people talking about us again? It's very important for my sense of self-worth.
The southern flank with long-range missiles and airstrikes, though they still face stiff defenses based out of Crimea. In the Pacific, the U.S. Navy and Air Force have yet to stage a counterattack against Chinese forces. Ongoing missile attacks have kept the U.S. fleet far out at sea and out of range of launching their own attacks. Losses continue to mount as Chinese land-based missile strikes seek out American ships or sink and cripple them. However, the number of missiles in the Chinese inventory is rapidly diminishing. On Taiwan, the first 2 beach assaults have failed, leading China to cancel their assaults. Over 5,000 Chinese soldiers lie dead on or just off of Taiwan's northern beaches. Chinese air assaults have met with similar failures, but thanks to fierce air support, 2 of the landing sites remain in Chinese control. It's cost the Chinese Air Force dearly, though, with over 50 aircraft destroyed in the first day of fighting alone. Across the islands, Chinese special forces inserted secretly onto the island prior to the invasion have struck out at Taiwanese political and military leadership. Several prominent politicians are either under arrest or dead. Efforts to evacuate senior Taiwanese leadership to the mainland, where they can be used for propaganda purposes, have ended in failure, and Taiwan's president remains out of grasp with Chinese kill teams. Rather than allow Taiwan to recapture officials, Chinese special forces execute them. Hour 48. Tankers have been escorting U.S. fighter and bomber aircraft across the Pacific nonstop for the last 2 days. The bulk of the U.S. Air Forces now are stationed in civilian and military airfields across Japan, as the Japanese self-defense forces successfully fend off the worst of China's continued but diminished missile attacks. Losses to U.S. aircraft on the ground remain significant, but enough aircraft are operational to begin offensive operations. The Chinese fleet has reinitiated amphibious assaults against Taiwan under the cover of a vicious air campaign. Most of Taiwan's air defenses have been neutralized by now, including the majority of the Taiwanese Air Force. However, as the assault commences, Chinese airborne radar detects a massive air assault of F-15 and F-18s, backed up with multiple tankers and EWACs for support. The F-18s have been launched from the surviving Pacific Fleet carriers and ferried to their destination with the support of drone tankers. The U.S. Air Force's F-15s have been flying for hours from Japanese air bases, accompanied by their Japanese allies. The U.S. and Japanese tanker fleet has remained in orbit around the seas south of Japan, topping off the massive air fleet and ready to help fuel-starved combatants return home. The largest air battle of modern war is about to begin. Chinese interceptors moved to defend the amphibious assault from both the northern and eastern air assault. China's lack of aircraft carriers forces the fighters to remain close to Taiwan's shore, which exposes them to surviving their defense units, forcing the Chinese to turn on afterburners and try to meet the American and Japanese forces out at sea. There's another reason for trying to close the distance as rapidly as possible, and it becomes apparent as the first missile lock warnings ring out across the cockpits of Chinese fighters. Stealthy F-22s and F-35s are leading the assault, launching new generation long-range air-to-air missiles at the Chinese jets. The result is dramatic, as Chinese fighters are forced to dive to try to juke off the American missiles. With 2 missiles fired at each hostile, many Chinese fighters fail to shake off the missiles and are splashed. But stealth fighters have one inherent weakness. They have a very low missile capacity due to the need to carry all weapons internally. Spent even before making visual contact, the F-22s are forced to turn around, but the F-35s press the attack. Their data link capabilities allow them to guide non-stealthy fighter weapons to targets, while keeping the vulnerable 4th-generation fighters away from the enemy jets. Another wave of missiles scream across the sky, guided by F-35s, that the Chinese are having difficulty picking up on radar. But the Chinese have an improved air-to-air missile with a range in excess of 200 miles, and they launch their own volleys back at the Americans and Japanese. They can't target the F-35s yet, but the F-18s and F-15s give off massive radar returns, and they're easy prey for the improved Chinese missiles. Friendly aircraft tumble out of the sky as the Chinese press into visual range of the attack. The F-35s immediately break off. They're not built for close-quarters combat. The F-15s and F-18s, however, are. Chinese J-10s, J-16s, and Su-30s are fine aircraft, but the F-15 Fighting Eagle has proven it is the superior machine in conflicts around the world. For every F-15 down, 4 enemy aircraft are splashed. The battle is far from decisive, but American and Japanese strike aircraft are able to penetrate Chinese air cover and deliver devastating blows to the assembled Chinese fleet. Air defenses have a difficult time taking out the attacking aircraft, thanks to their use of long-range standoff attack munitions. Missile defenses, however, do their best to fend off the attack and succeed with a kill rate of about 60%. But many Chinese ships are still struck and either sunk or rendered combat ineffective. By the end of the second day of fighting, America has finally struck back in an inconclusive air battle that saw both sides take steep losses. Its fleet of stealthy F-22s and F-35s, however, remains largely intact, but it's feared that there are simply too few to carry on the fight. Conspicuously, China's Chengdu J-20 has yet to make an appearance on the battlefield. Despite the setback in the air, China has managed to secure a beachhead on Taiwan. Now the unloading of the massive Chinese army can begin, but Taiwanese resistance is far from broken. Over in Europe, NATO forces in the Baltic states are exhausted and overwhelmed, with many surrendering to the Russians. It'll be a few days yet, but Russia's on the verge of reclaiming lost Soviet territories. However, the war is far from over, and NATO will quickly be capable of launching massive ground assaults against Russia, starting with Kaliningrad. Hour 72. Fierce fighting rages on in the major cities of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. But NATO's 40,000-strong response force has been neutralized by Russian forces. The cost has been steep, but with conventional forces largely defeated in the Baltics, the massive Russian war machine begins to swing south towards Kaliningrad, which has been decimated by ongoing missile attacks. The battle for the heart of Europe will commence in days, as NATO uses Poland as a staging ground for its counterattack. In the Pacific, U.S. losses of ships and aircraft are steep, and additional material from the U.S.'s other global commands is being rushed to the Pacific. However, Chinese losses are even steeper. In a race of attrition, China will ultimately lose, and it's vital that Taiwan be captured as quickly as possible. U.S. forces, however, have begun a naval blockade of China, cutting it off from its naval trade routes. Sensing an opportunity to seriously weaken its regional rival, India joins in the blockade, sealing China off from importing the oil and natural gas it desperately needs. Land supply routes to Russia are still available, but the steep drop in supply causes energy prices to skyrocket. Like Russia discovered in Ukraine, Taiwanese resistance to hostile invaders is stiff and deadly. Chinese troops are engaged in fierce street fighting, with civilian militias taking up arms provided by the government against the invaders. The Taiwanese people have no desire to be a part of Xi Jinping's China. and they make the People's Liberation Army pay dearly for every inch of Taiwan they take. Hour 168. Across Chinese social media, images of the ghastly cost of the Taiwan invasion are being spread. Taiwanese and American cyber warfare agents have managed to penetrate the Chinese Great Firewall, and now photos and videos of the devastation in Taiwan are being spread faster than Chinese censors can stop. The Chinese people have for generations been told that a conquest of Taiwan would be easy and bloodless, but the high cost in terms of human lives is now clear for all of China to see. The Chinese Communist Party has used the state media apparatus to lie about casualty figures, reporting only a trickle of casualties each day, hoping to keep the public outrage down. Anger and outrage quickly builds. In Europe, NATO's Second Response Force has engaged Russian forces across the Franco-Polish border. Russian air defense batteries have been greatly attrited through ongoing strikes against them, but the cost has been high for the pilots of Europe's air forces. American stealth aircraft are badly needed in the Pacific, and the job of suppressing Russian air defenses falls on Europe's largely non-stealth air force. The outcome of World War III will be decided on Poland and Taiwan. Hour 336. 2 weeks after the start of World War III, the momentum of the Russian war machine has begun to stall out in light of stiff and well-organized resistance by NATO forces. The invasion of Ukraine has proven that the much-feared Russian military juggernaut is a clumsy giant, defeated more by its own ineptitude than foreign military powers. While Western armies place a strong emphasis on logistics, Russian military forces have approximately 25% the logistics personnel of NATO militaries. This means massive convoys of Russian vehicles stuck on the side of roads, highways, starved of fuel and ammunition. Russian troops, especially its conscript forces, suffering from catastrophically low morale as they come under fire from advanced NATO weapon systems. Surrenders of entire units are growing increasingly common, and the high casualties are causing a massive political dissent back home. Strong-handed police tactics against anti-war protesters can barely restrain the tide of malcontent sweeping across Russia, and Vladimir Putin's hold on power grows more tenuous by the day. While the Russian attack hasn't been repelled, it has been ground to a halt just inside Poland's borders. The arrival of a large American army unit on the continent marks the beginning of offensive operations for NATO, and the future looks grim for a Russian military suffering from bad equipment, low morale, and terrible logistics. The Russian Air Force, however, continues to perform well, though equipment and maintenance shortfalls have begun affecting it as well. Slowly but surely, European NATO forces have wrestled control of the skies away from Russia, and over the coming day, Russian frontline units will be exposed to the full wrath of NATO air. In the Pacific, China has maintained its hold on the western half of Taiwan, but at a staggering cost. Over 15,000 Chinese troops are dead or wounded, where the Chinese Communist Party works hard to keep those figures hidden from an increasingly angry Chinese public. They were promised a swift victory over the tiny island, and that the United States could be defeated in the Pacific with China's advanced missiles and aircraft. Neither of these have proven true, and while the U.S. has suffered massive losses of ships and planes, it's able to replenish losses faster than the Chinese Navy and Air Force. Taiwan's defenders have so far repelled China's attempts to push through the east of the island, and now American Marines are arriving in force. To the world's great surprise, U.S. Marines are backed up by Japanese troops, who have revoked their pacifist constitution in the name of regional defense against an aggressive China. But it's not just the Japanese joining the U.S. in defending Taiwan, as the Australians join America in defense of the Pacific. China alone, in the region with no friends, is now facing the monumental task of defeating 3 major powers simultaneously. As losses mount for the Sino-Russian alliance, both President Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin consider their final option. Nuclear power is the great equalizer, and the one way that Russia can overcome NATO's overmatch of its own military forces. But for every one strike that Russia or China may undertake, NATO will respond with 2 in an escalatory ladder that will end with the world in ashes. Russia's on the warpath, and if successful in Ukraine is unlikely to stop there. Lithuania, with EU support, has shut off the flow of military and economic material to the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, triggering a threat of invasion by Russia in retaliation. A world away, China flexes its muscles as it threatens the United States and their continued support for Taiwan. Fears of World War III are growing by the day, and the United States is taking them very, very seriously. Before we discuss how the U.S. is preparing for the Third World War, first we need to know what its potential enemies are doing. China has long been preparing for a confrontation with the U.S. as it seeks to become the world's dominant superpower. Currently, China falls short of the qualifications for a global superpower, qualifications which only the U.S. fills at the moment. But with its dizzying economic and military growth, it might be less than a decade before the Chinese Communist Party can project power all over the world. China's preparations for a showdown with the West include dislodging the United States as the most important economic power in the world. It also has safeguards to its own economic interests in the wake of economic warfare versus the U.S. And to achieve this aim in 2013, it launched the Belt and Road Initiative. This massively ambitious plan included building new land and sea trade routes all over the world to connect China economically with nations all the way from Europe to Africa. To achieve this, the nation has not just invested in its own infrastructure, but in building trade infrastructure in other nations as well. However, China's partnership with host nations is more often than not extremely predatory. They offer economic loans to build massive projects that promise economic prosperity, like seaports and rail yards. However, the terms of those loans often dictate that Chinese companies must be hired to do the construction, leaving few jobs for locals. Interest rates on the debt traps is often so high that a poor third world nation is guaranteed to default. Included in the penalties for defaulting are clauses such as China owning exclusive rights to the infrastructure it builds for terms as long as a century. It is in effect a modern version of soft colonialism. China's plan is to have heavy influence in the trade of goods throughout Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, putting it in a very strong position to dictate geopolitics in its ever-growing sphere of influence. China's next preparation for war with the U.S. includes securing its vulnerable trade routes through the South China Sea and the very valuable oil and natural gas deposits in the region, as well as the remaining rich fishing grounds. This effort began with the construction of artificial islands in 2013. Which continued unopposed despite an international ruling by the World Court in The Hague that such island building and claims to economic exclusion zones around them were illegal. Foreign pressure also failed to stop China from stealing claims to oil supplies by neighbors such as Vietnam, or of using its coast guard to bully and intimidate the emerging fishing fleets of other nations out of their own territorial waters. These islands have now become heavily fortified military installations, which include modern missile defenses, runways long enough for a long-range attack aircraft, and an ever-growing network of surveillance assets, all geared for one purpose: detect, track, and destroy the U.S. Navy. Further preparations have included the addition of dozens of new ships to the People's Liberation Navy, which is now officially the largest in the world. Recently, China's second aircraft carrier came online, and in a few years will be ready for battle, greatly enhancing the CCP's reach in all the important sea and air domains. With Russia's increased belligerence in Europe, there is a serious concern that the two nations might partner up in an attempt to turn the current U.S.-led world order on its head. Despite China's increasing capabilities, it still does not have the power to defeat the U.S. in a one-on-one confrontation, and it might hope to split the U.S. attention by partnering with Russia, thus forcing America to choose fighting between China in the Pacific or Russia in Europe. For decades, the United States maintained a policy of fielding a powerful enough military to fight and win two simultaneous wars against near-peer adversaries. However, with China's rapid ascension, this has become officially impossible without bankrupting the U.S. Thus, America has been forced to accept that it may only be able to defeat one near-peer adversary at a time. The question is, how is the U.S. preparing to do that, given the increasing likelihood of China and Russia starting a third world war? First, the situation in the Pacific might seem dire, with China's numerically superior Navy, but the real measure of naval power is not the number of vessels, but in the number of battle force missiles. These are the number of missiles that both navies can bring to bear against each other. The U.S. maintains around 10,000 missiles versus the PLAN's estimated 2,000. Though those numbers have changed and will continue to change as China fields larger vessels and both navies shift in composition. It's estimated that by 2030, China might have closed the gap in battle force missiles to two-thirds of U.S. capabilities. The U.S.'s first line of defense against China is the place that's likely to be ground zero for World War III, Taiwan. The small island democracy broke away from the mainland after the nationalists were expelled by the communists in the aftermath of World War II. Since then, the former dictatorship has become a vibrant democracy that has refused to reunify and put themselves under control of the Chinese Communist Party. Securing Taiwan is not just important for the ever-intensifying global clash between authoritarianism and democracy, but also for very important political and economic reasons. Firstly, Taiwan produces around 50% of the world's semiconductors after U.S. companies ceased production at home due to expense. Semiconductors are important for every single gadget in your life. The global economy quite literally runs on them, and they become as valuable as a commodity as gas and oil. China itself produces between 25 and 30% of the world's semiconductor supply. So if China were to take Taiwan, it would now be in control of 3/4 of the global semiconductor supply. This would allow China to effectively shut down the economy of any nation that disagrees with it by simply barring the sale of semiconductors to it, giving China incredible power to further control global affairs and reducing the West's ability to oppose its authoritarianism. Taiwan is also politically important, as it makes up part of what's known as the First Island Chain. This is a chain of islands that extends from Japan to the Philippines. It acts as a very physical barrier to the expansion of Chinese influence in the Pacific. If China were to take Taiwan, it would not just break this carefully orchestrated containment strategy, but allow China to effectively neuter Japan's ability to resist it. With aircraft and ships stationed off Taiwan, China could target Japan's lines of communication and trade routes that cross the Pacific and hem the nation in, forcing it into subservience under threat of economic starvation. If China takes Taiwan, the U.S. commitments to defend the Philippines and Japan would be made much more difficult, if not impossible. To defend Taiwan, the U.S. has inked several deals, selling the nation advanced weapon systems ranging from fighter aircraft to air and missile defenses. U.S. military advisors have worked closely with the Taiwanese counterparts for years to prepare the nation for invasion. Despite threats from China, the flow of U.S. arms to Taiwan continues unabated, and recently U.S. President Joe Biden publicly voiced for the first time an unacknowledged truth in American politics. The United States will come to the defense of Taiwan in case of invasion. This greatly angered China, and the White House press corps was quick to walk the statement back. But what seemed like a political guffaw was likely yet another bit of intrigue meant to further the American strategy of keeping China guessing as to how the U.S. might react to an invasion. If China cannot accurately predict what America will do should it invade Taiwan, it serves to create confusion and doubt amongst Chinese leadership. Should China prepare its economy for a flurry of global sanctions like Russia received after its invasion of Ukraine, or should China expect American F-18s to swarm the skies over Taiwan and sink their invasion fleets? Strategic ambiguity is a powerful tool, and political theater is an excellent method for creating it. But the U.S. is not planning on fighting a war against China alone. To this end, it has helped increase the capabilities of allies such as Japan, and most notably Australia, who recently signed a military cooperation pact between itself, the United States, and the United Kingdom. The pact will not just provide security cooperation between the countries, but also help arm Australia with a fleet of nuclear attack submarines. This is of grave concern to the Chinese, who recently attempted to charm Australia away from its relationship with the U.S., a tactic which ultimately failed. In 10 years' time, China might not have to face off just against the U.S. and British submarines, but Australian submarines also, putting the People's Liberation Navy as well as its all-important sea trade routes at increased risk. China imports most of its oil and gas over its seaborne trade routes, and this is exactly what the U.S. is preparing to target in case of war, in order to strangle the Chinese economy. Recently, security meetings between Japan, India, the U.S., and Australia were revived after a pause during President Trump's term. The Quad, as it's informally known, aims to tackle global problems such as global warming, cybersecurity, and ensuring a free and open trade environment in the Pacific. This is a veiled implication of the Quad's discussions on how to best handle China's expansion in the South Pacific. Currently, the Quad has no military commitment to each other, but that might change in the future as President Joe Biden makes the South Pacific and confronting China an area of pressing concern for the U.S. India is the only nation in the Quad without a formal security agreement with the U.S., and it has historically refused to sign on to any security partnerships with any nation. However, that may soon change as tensions between India and China escalate, and it becomes clear that India is not able to win a war against the superior Chinese military on its own. Bringing India into the network of security alliances in the South Pacific would effectively hem China in on all sides, and more importantly, put allied ships and planes directly in the path of China's trade routes through the Indian Ocean. But the United States is also taking very material steps to confronting China. War with China would be waged at sea and in the skies, with very little of any action between the People's Liberation Army and the U.S. Army. This will be a war of ships and planes, not of tanks and artillery.